These supporters of trans rights activists are obviously not homophobic or men's rights supporters, so why do they believe they're in the right, especially as not a single one of them has actively made any effort to specifically denounce the abuse given out by trans rights activists? There may be a few reasons, but in general, it appears that trans rights activists and groups like Stonewall and Mermaids have been successful in pushing incorrect and misleading statistics that paint a very different story around transgender people than the evidence suggests is true. There are two main areas around which these statistics have been misrepresented. These are the rates of murder of trans people and suicide rates in young trans people denied surgery or hormone treatment, and both are used to paint UK transgender people as a very oppressed group. However, drilling down into these statistics shows a very different story indeed. Transgender murders are almost entirely localised to Brazil, Mexico and the United States, and around 2/3 of victims were sex workers and were black. When looked at in comparison to murder rates in each country, the statistics show that murder rates of trans people are actually much lower than for people in those countries overall, at around 1/3 the national average. In fact, in America, the numbers are trending downwards year by year, despite claims of an epidemic of murder pushed forward by trans rights activists. Looking further, it appears that the vast majority of those murders were associated with sex work, drugs or domestic violence, rather than any transphobic motives of the perpetrators. Bringing this back to the UK, there is no evidence at all that transgender people are being killed at any higher rate than the overall population. In fact, since the year 2000, less than 10 trans people have been murdered, including one case of a trans person murdered by another. Again, we see a pattern of domestic violence, drugs or sex work as the motives for these murders. In that same period, there have been 24 murders perpetrated by trans people, 23 by trans women and 1 by a trans man. The claim that trans people are being murdered every week or that there's a sudden transphobic murder spree taking place are just completely without evidence in the UK. It's interesting to look at the murder rates of women over the past 20 years too, as a comparison. In 2019 alone, there were more than 240 female victims of homicide, the highest number since 2006, and these murder rates are rising year on year. The other area misrepresented by trans activists is suicide rates in young trans people denied surgery or hormone treatment, with some truly terrifying statistics appearing in the press from trans rights activists and their supporters, often mentioned to justify or excuse their misogynistic or abusive behaviour. Gender dysphoria sufferers, according to trans rights activists and groups like Mermaids and Stonewall, are committing suicide in extremely high numbers, and social and medical transition, including irreversible surgery on children, is the only way to prevent this fate. According to Mermaids, Stonewall and others, some 48% of young trans people have attempted to commit suicide. As emotionally strong as this claim may be, again there isn't much evidence to support this number, nor the fact that affirmation and social and medical transition is the only solution to gender dysphoria in children. In actual fact, the reverse may be true. Fair Play for Women, a group led by Dr. Nicola Williams, looked into UK studies conducted by Stonewall and PACE, another LGBT charitable organisation, and found fundamental weaknesses in these studies which seriously undermine the claims of these groups. We won't go into all of the details here, but we will leave a link to their findings in the description below. They found that the figure of 48% of young trans people attempting to commit suicide came from a survey from PACE. Dr. Williams discovered that only 120 transgender people were questioned, of which only 27 respondents were under the age of 26 years old. Of these 27 young trans people, 13 reported having attempted suicide at some point in the past. As well as a number of issues around the way this survey was carried out and analysed, Dr. Williams has pointed out some major flaws in using this data to justify the trans rights activists' claims. Firstly, and most obviously, a sample size of 27 people is not sufficiently large enough to give any real evidence on this issue. Also, the study did not ascertain when these suicide attempts took place, either before or after medical transition, so don't accurately reflect the true suicide risk if trans children are not supported to transition. Mermaids, the charity group supporting medical and social transition of young people, are also claimed to have used these statistics in a very misleading way, stating that the 48% figure comes from a survey of over 2,000 trans people, rather than a survey of 2,000 LGBT people, of whom a total of only 27 identified as trans. Obviously, suicide is a very tragic thing, but exaggerating the risks and constantly using the threat of suicide to emotionally blackmail people makes the gender ideology movement look very disingenuous, and is actually very irresponsible, as parents who think their child is suicidal may treat them differently and make different decisions based on that information. Young people have a very high rate of suicide attempts in general when compared to the overall population, and gay, lesbian and bisexual young people who do not identify as trans also have incredibly high suicide attempt rates. Dr. Williams' findings were also confirmed by the UK independent fact-checking charity Full Fact, who stated that they can't say how representative this is of the young trans community in Britain as a whole, as the overall sample was not adjusted to try and be representative. Further than this, the Tavistock and Portman Gender Identity Development Service states that among children referred to their clinic, suicide is extremely rare. Dr. Polly Carmichael, Director and Consultant Clinical Psychologist at the Tavistock Clinic, stated that the PACE survey is deeply flawed, and that rates of self-harm, distress and suicidal ideation are similar to children and young people's mental health service figures overall. None of this is to say that suicide rates among young people or young gay, lesbian, bisexual and trans-identifying people aren't crazily high. They are, and this is a huge problem. What we are saying is that using misleading statistics around suicide rates to promote gender transition in children is problematic at best, underhanded and immoral at worst. Just as a side note here, it seems that mermaids are slowly but surely being found out at the moment for pushing these misleading stats and promoting the transition of children and young people. In the course of writing and creating this video, they've been dropped by the BBC from their trans information pages.
I have heard activists say that we have to allow children to medically transition to prevent them from killing themselves. I hear this a lot. It's one of the most powerful arguments that trans activists make, and it's very compelling. No parent wants to be responsible for the death of their child, especially by suicide. This is such an incredibly profound case of emotional blackmail. And I just want to point something out to people, that if you have a child who is so emotionally distressed that they're threatening suicide, that child needs to belong in a behavior unit. That child needs intensive mental health services. That child is not emotionally capable of making big decisions about their life. And that child is not in a position to make long-term decisions about their health and well-being. Now, there are lots of cases where a child might threaten suicide. But here we have children who are saying they're going to kill themselves if they don't get harmful drugs. And the parents and the doctors acquiesce. They say we have to give them these drugs or else they're going to kill themselves. It reminds me a little bit of anorexics. If an anorexic threatened to kill herself if doctors didn't give her liposuction, the doctors wouldn't give her liposuction, her parents wouldn't give her liposuction, and teachers wouldn't encourage her to pursue liposuction. No. We would get that child help quickly because we'd know that there was a problem, that that child felt so uncomfortable in her body that she wanted to kill herself if she couldn't change it. And that's what gender identity disorder, gender dysphoria, a trans identity is all about. It's about being so uncomfortable in your body that you want to change it. So we have children who are experiencing this extreme distress with their body and who are threatening suicide. And we're saying, yes, we should give them drugs. We should give them what they want. We should give them what they ask for. This is so irresponsible on so many levels. It's medical malpractice, and it's horrifying that trans activists are telling parents that it's better to have a transgender child than a dead child. They're telling parents that their children are going to kill themselves if they're not allowed to transition. So basically they're admitting that these children have serious mental health issues. We're giving them drugs that are going to damage their bodies for the rest of their lives.